The early anime scenes outside of Japan were heavily defined by which shows got licensed. And unlike today, where we're drowning in seasonal anime, in the 80s and 90s, the pickings in the English market amounted to small handfuls in two categories. The larger category was cut and paste localizations for TV, which were heavily censored and mostly stuff aimed at children. Uncut releases were much fewer, and there was a heavy bias toward dark, violent shows and particularly cyberpunk, in part thanks to one of the first anime to be licensed and released this way, Bubblegum Crisis. Originally envisioned as a remake of an unrelated movie, Bubblegum Crisis is an 8-episode OVA that began in 1987. The series was made in collaboration between two companies, ArtMike and Yomax. Partway through production, relations between the two broke down, and they ended up only producing 8 episodes out of the planned 13 until the story was later finished with another OVA and then remade in the 90s. The first Bubblegum Crisis itself, though, is well remembered as a success in the wave of all things grimy, gritty, and neon punk rock. The title is meant to reflect a tense situation that's going to explode any minute. And there's also a theory that, given the time the OVA came out, it might be a metaphor or at least a reference to the then current issue of the bubble economy. In the then far-flung future of 2032, Tokyo has been fractured by an earthquake, and the largest fragment, called Mega Tokyo, is a deeply divided pit of despair where the ultra-rich run roughshod over the poor, evicting people for the land under their apartments, turning away at mass deaths, and, in the case of Genom, a megacorp that calls itself the ruler of the world behind closed doors, not so secretly developing killer robots called boomers and loosing them on the populace. All the jokes have already been made. The police have a task force trying to stop the boomers being directed to kill, but it more often than not gets them killed too, and the chief of police discourages anyone from looking too deep into Genom, calling their obvious connection just a conspiracy theory. Thus, a group of vigilantes/mercenaries called the Night Sabers, composed of 4 young women who hide their identities from the populace, are left to clean up the streets. Chris, a biker and lead singer of a band that plays underground nightclubs, Lena, an aerobics instructor, it was the 80s, who opens her heart to everyone, Celia, a lingerie entrepreneur and conflicted corporate heiress, and Nena, a cutesy daydreaming police dispatcher who uses her insider knowledge for the team. Using super advanced combat suits, they fight the ever-evolving boomers that are being tested on civilians, but it's not easy. At least half the people they try to save end up turbo-murdered anyway, and the issues each of them are hiding that drove them to fight for justice in the first place threaten to bubble to the surface. Bubblegum Crisis is a solid OVA that's earned its reputation as a classic. It looks fantastic, it sounds fantastic, and you can definitely tell when it was made, but that's not a bad thing. The story is dark and often depressing, but those emotional beats hit more often than not, even though the story gets weird on the regular. This is a series where you can hear that a line of recalled sex robots have a design flaw that makes them need to drink human blood unless they get an upgrade installed via floppy disk. And that story arc will still make you cry. And unfortunately, untouchable megacorporations doing increasingly obvious evil for the sake of evil as the cops stand by doesn't seem so exaggerated now, and didn't in the 80s either. Another high point is the music. Every episode has a unique ending sequence and at least one insert song, often performed by the in-universe band Chris and the Replicants. And every one of them is, as they said in 1987, totally rad. The dub does have translation covers of all the songs, which is impressive for when it was made. If I have to list some low points, there's one big one, the ending, or rather, lack thereof. Because of the studio office politics mentioned earlier, Crisis cuts off before it can finish. ArtMike later made their own short OVA of the ending, Bubblegum Crash, which I'll cover in its own video eventually. But suffice to say, that was cut short too, due to legal issues and made some clunky retcons to the original. I also need to warn that, while the recurring gay character lives to the end, uncommonly praiseworthy in 1987 when there was barely any MLM rep in anime at all, we do have a case of bury your gays on our hands here with a couple of very queer-coded ladies who get very close to a main character and are promptly killed off to make her sad about it. So that happens. And as far as the aforementioned dub, it was clearly an early 90s dub, awkward in spots and with a cast that mostly hadn't done professional voice work before or since, so the songs were dubbed by an in-house band instead of the voice actors. Bubblegum Crisis was first licensed and released in 1991 in North America by Animego, and in a rare occurrence for these retrospectives, and even for the franchise it spawned, it's been with the same licensor ever since. No expiries, no drops, no rescues. It's had releases on VHS, DVD, and now Blu-ray, both subbed and dubbed, and it's also sub-only streaming on RetroCrush. In the UK and Australia, it's a different story, where Bubblegum Crisis was licensed by Madman in Australia and MBM in the UK, both of which have expired. These releases did use the Anime Go dub. As I mentioned, it also spun off a pretty big franchise at the time, despite the initial production troubles. The original continuity has the sequel, Bubblegum Crash, the prequel, 80 Police Files, and a spin-off of that, 80 Police to Protect and Serve. Then there's the 90s remake, Bubblegum Crisis Tokyo 2040, a light novel adaptation, a licensed tabletop RPG, an American comic, a couple of video games, and also a weird non-canon OVA called Scramble Wars that crossed over their characters with other dystopian combat series of the time in a wacky races parody. I'll probably end up covering at least some of the additional anime on the channel. They also announced a live-action movie in 2009, but no one's heard anything in quite some time on that. Probably for the better. A lot has been said in recent years about the cyberpunk anime of the late 80s and early 90s, particularly on the subject of Japan doing its own take on a genre that's historically relied on fear of the Japanese. It's also interesting to look at how the genre was disproportionately licensed in those days, leading to things like sports and slice-of-life anime taking a long time to gain a foothold in the Anglosphere because the anime community was mostly fans of dark action. Bubblegum Crisis is an important piece of history in both of these contexts, but even aside from that, it's just a really good show, and one that deserves the praise it got back in the day. I suggest checking it out. This is Secret Identity Studio, and the Hot Legs nightclub still just reminds me of that meme about frying an egg. Seriously, how is Celia 22? I could have sworn she was at least 30. Anime ages.